In this lesson, we're going to take a quick look at the Bracero program and spend most of the lesson taking a look at events that took place regarding Japanese Americans during World War II. When you think about it, it really shouldn't come as a surprise. We desperately needed workers. That's why the call went out for women to come and work in the factories, and anybody that could really to pitch in. At one point, Roosevelt was trying to get a plan for high school students to be able to get some credit for working in the factories as well. The farms needed workers as well. So you can see here the Bracero program was created, which invited 200,000 Mexicans were brought in to work on the farms in the Southwest, California and the like, all right, during World War II. And I would love to be able to tell you that they were welcome to stay after the war was over and work their way towards citizenship, but that was in fact not what happened. They were basically sent back, packing back to Mexico after the war was over. 2 months after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, February of 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed for the military, authorized the military to round up all people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. The concern at the time was that of the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, a number of them were potentially spies, and since they couldn't separate out those that they thought were spies from those that were just regular law-abiding citizens, the decision was made to round them all up, take them away from the West Coast. And the reason for this was because of the shipyards that were being built there. It would be very easy for them to look in and see how many ships were being built, what kinds of ships were being built, how fast the ships were being built, and potentially relay that information to Japan. We see here that they were placed in places called internment camps. So they were taken off the West Coast. 110,000 Japanese Americans were taken off the West Coast and placed in detention centers. All right, these detention centers were known as internment camps, and they were placed there for the duration of the war, which means about 4 years. Here we see Japanese families. Obviously, they were given a week or 2 weeks notice, so they had to sell their businesses, their homes. They lost everything and sold for a fraction of what these things were worth. You can see the poster on the store in the bottom right. I am an American. Many of the 110,000 Japanese Americans were American citizens, and the others were resident aliens. What follows are some photos. I think these are mostly of the Heart Mountain internment camp, but this is an example of the kinds of conditions that they were forced under, and of course there were guards watching them. You can see the barbed wire fencing. All right, and they were detained in conditions like this for the duration of the war. The irony of this is that the 442nd Nisei Regiment, this was an all-Japanese American Army regiment, was the most highly decorated regiment that fought in World War II. And of course they fought against Japan. So you had Japanese Americans fighting against Japan, and those soldiers' families were in conditions forcibly detained in these conditions. Fred Korematsu refused. All right, he was arrested. I believe technically, actually, it violated the curfew at the time. But anyway, he refused and was arrested, convicted. All right, and his case was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. Under the basic question the Supreme Court had to deal with was whether or not the government has the right to detain an entire group, all right, in this case Japanese people of Japanese descent, because we were at war with Japan. It was a 6-3 decision. What do you think? Before we flip to the next one, take a moment and think about it. Where would you, if you were a Supreme Court justice, fall on this issue? All right, Justice Hugo Black delivered the 6-person majority opinion, which indicates here, you can take a second and read it, but basically because they couldn't separate the spies, those that they thought were spies, what they're calling disloyal here, from the loyal members of the group, they upheld this out of military necessity, right? National security issues. And this is still currently the law in the land. Here we have a quote from the minority opinion, the three dissenters on the Supreme Court, which does not have the force of law the way the majority opinion does, but rings a lot more true to people reading this and learning about this case today. Makes sense to us from our perspective sitting in modern times, all right, that the exclusion of all people of Japanese ancestry, all right, on the plea of military necessity, goes over the brink of constitutional power and falls into the ugly abyss of racism. As much as we might agree with this position, many people would agree with this position today, it's the other position that is current law. Even though the other side, the fact that it was military necessity, they found that the president did have the authority to do that, doesn't mean that the government can't recognize that it made a mistake. And that's what the American Civil Liberties Act did. That's what Congress did in passing the American Civil Liberties Act of 1988. They recognized they did something wrong during World War II, apologized for it. All right, so this is a formal government apology, provides for an education fund to maintain awareness about the internment, and makes restitution to those internees that were alive in 1988. I'll just move this up so that you can read the rest of it. All right, but again, it's a formal government apology. Here we see President Reagan signing the American Civil Liberties Act. A few years earlier, he had voided Fred Korematsu's conviction. 2 presidents later, President Clinton is giving Mr. Korematsu the highest award that any civilian can be awarded, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, for his actions during the war. And you can see here each internee was given $20,000. So this, of course, didn't cover their losses, especially 40-some-odd years later. All right, but really was a sincere attempt by Congress to apologize for the actions that the government had taken during. So then, just to sum up, we see here FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which led to the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans. And this was fear-based, all right, for the duration of the war, 4 years. All right, the Korematsu versus United States Supreme Court case upheld the government's actions as constitutional, as a wartime necessity. All right, and then 40 years later, under President Reagan, the government formally apologized for its actions during the war.